Hi and welcome to Tristan's channel. Today I'll be going over the history of sex and gender distinction. Sex is distinct from gender, which can refer to either social roles based on the sex of a person, gender role, or personal identification of one's own gender, based on an internal awareness, gender identity, while in ordinary speech the terms sex and gender are often used interchangeably. Most contemporary social scientists, behavioural scientists and biologists, many legal systems and government bodies and intergovernmental agencies such as the WHO make a distinction between gender and sex. In most individuals, the various biological determinations of sex are congruent and consistent with the individual's gender identity, but in some circumstances, an individual's assigned sex and gender do not align, and the person may be transgender. In other cases, an individual may have sex characteristics that complicate sex assignment, and the person may be intersex. Sexologist John Money is often regarded as the first to introduce a distinction between biological sex and gender identity/role in 1955, although Madison Bentley had already defined gender as the socialized obverse of sex a decade earlier. Also, it should be noted that John Money was a sick man who abused children and was a paedophile. As originally conceived by Money, gender and sex are analysed together as a single category, including both biological and social elements. But later work by Robert Stoller separated the two, designating sex and gender as biological and cultural categories respectively. Before the work of Bentley, Money and Stoller, the word gender was only regularly used to refer to grammatical categories. History of sex. Historian Thomas W. Laqueur suggests that from the Renaissance to the 18th century there was a prevailing inclination among doctors towards the existence of only one biological sex, the one-sex theory that women and men had the same fundamental reproductive structure. In some discourses, this view persisted into the 18th and 19th centuries. Laqueur asserts that even at its peak, the one-sex model was supported among highly educated Europeans, but it is not known to have been a popular view or one entirely agreed upon by doctors who treated the general population. Scholars such as Joan Cadden and Michael Stolberg have criticised Laqueur's theory. Stolberg provides evidence to suggest that the significant two-sex understandings of anatomy existed before Laqueur's claims, arguing that sexual dimorphism was accepted as early as the 16th century. Joan Cadden has stated that one-sex models of the body were already treated with skepticism in the ancient and medieval periods, and that Laqueur's periodization of the shift from one sex to two sex was not as clear-cut as he made it out to be. Sex and gender took stage in America in the times of war, in the time of wars when women had to work and men were at war. Biology. Asiogamy, or the size differences of gametite sex cells, is the defining features of the two sexes. According to the biologist Michael Majuras, there is no other universal difference between male and females. By definition, males are organisms that produce small mobile gametes, sperm, while females are organisms that produce large and generally immobile gametes, ova, or eggs. Richard Dawkins states that it is possible to interpret all differences between the sexes as stemming from this single difference in gametes. Probably pronounced it wrong anyway. Bagava et al. In 2021 noted that the terms sex and gender are not and should not be used as interchangeable terms. They state that sex is dichotomous with sex determination in the fertilized zygote stemming from an unequal expression of sex chromosomal genes. In contrast, gender is seen as including perception of the individual as male, female, or other, both by the individual and by society. The authors differentiate between sex differences caused by biological factors and gender differences, which reflect a complex interplay of sociological, environmental, cultural, and biological factors. Gender is thus seen as a psychological concept that refers to an individual's self-perception. Other studies have noted that whilst there is some tentative evidence for a potential genetic, neuroanatomical and hormonal basis for gender identity, the specific biological mechanisms involved have not yet been demonstrated. The term sex differences is typically applied to sexually dimorphic traits that are hypothesized to be evolved consequences of sexual selection. For example, the human sex difference in height is a consequence of sexual selection, while the gender difference, typically seen in head hair length, women with longer hair, is not. Scientific research shows an individual's sex influences his or her behavior. Sex differences are primarily caused by hormonal, genetic, and environmental factors. According to David Geary, the most fundamental sex difference in humans is the retrospective cost of reproduction, which is higher for females than males because of pregnancy and higher postnatal parental expenditure, resulting in different mating choice preferences for males and females. Psychiatrists. Robert Stoller, whose work was the first to treat sex and gender as two different orders of data, in his book Sex and Gender, The Development of the Masculinity and Femininity, uses the term sex to refer to the male or the female sex and the component biological parts that determine whether one is male or female. He further states that in order to determine sex chromosomes and external genitalia, internal genitalia, gonads, hormonal states, secondary sex characteristics, and possibly also brain systems must be analysed. He states that a person's sex is determined by an algebraic sum of all these qualities, resulting in most people being classified as either male or female. The American Psychiatric Association states that sex is often described as a biological construct defined on an anatomical, hormonal, or genetic basis and assigned/given at birth based on external genitalia. Psychology. In the psychology of gender, it is stated that sex refers to the biological categories of female and male categories, distinguished by genes, chromosomes, and hormones. One of the context-dependent guidelines used by the American Psychological Association states that there are a number of indicators of biological sex, including sex chromosomes, gonads, internal reproductive organs, and external genitalia. Sociology. Sociologist Dudley Poston states that sex in humans is determined biologically in 5 ways. Based on different chromosomes, based on different gonads, which produce the gametes and sex hormones, based on different relative levels of sex-specific hormones, based on different internal reproductive structures, based on different sex-specific external genitals. This definition usually results in the assignment of sex at birth. According to Poston, sex refers mainly to biological characteristics, while gender refers mainly to sociological characteristics. While noting that typically sex is assigned based on genital inspection at birth, Rain Dozier states that biological sex is a complex constellation of chromosomes, hormones, genitalia, and reproductive organs. What dictionaries say? Sex is annotated as different from gender in the Oxford English Dictionary, where it says sex tends now to refer to biological differences, while gender often refers to cultural or social ones. Merriam-Webster defines sex as either of the two major forms of individuals that occur in many species and that are distinguished respectively as female or male, especially on their basis of their reproductive organs and structures, or the sum of the structural, functional, and sometimes behavioural characteristics of the organisms that distinguish male and females. They also note that doctors can alter the physical characteristics of sex, but bodily sex does not determine gender. Public health organisations, the World Health Organization, similarly states that sex refers to the biological and the physiological characteristics that define men and women, and that male and female are sex categories. According to the CDC, people whose internal physiological experience differs from their assigned sex are transgender, transsexual, or non-binary. History. There is little general agreement among archaeologists about what can be accurately stated about gender identity roles and processes in the earliest human societies. Between 40,000 and 4,000 years before the present, there is a consensus that cultures at this time differentiated categories of people by gender. If this is defined as a rule of behaviour and roles based on sex, it is likely that the highly differentiated cultures of this period did not possess a single gender classification system, and instead their concept of gender may have been culture specific, much like contemporary societies. It is feasible that some of the cultures of this era recognized up to 5 genders. For example, certain production roles, spiritual leaders and healers may have been recognized as distinct genders. Whether or not social roles, such as religious, were based upon gender rather than age or skills, continues to be debated. Some archaeological evidence suggests that gender, in the sense of social and behavioural distinctions, arose at least early by some 30,000 years ago. More evidence was found as of 26,000 years ago, at least at the archaeological site Doliano Vestonce and others in what is now the Czech Republic. This is during the Upper Paleolithic time period. From the Mesolithic, various evidence suggests that gender differentiated tool use and diet in some cultures. By this time, it is likely that gender had become an important element of the organisational structure of these societies. Similar grave goods found in male and female high-status burials of this period, however, indicate that status was not simply based on gender. There is also so much more evidence for the recognition of third and fourth genders from this period. In 2011, it was reported that an untypical corded ware burial dated to between 2900 and 2500 BC had been discovered in Prague. The remains, believed to be anatomically male, were orientated in the same way as a woman's burial, and were not accompanied by any gender-specific grave goods. Based on this, the archaeologist Kamila Vesenova suggests that it was likely that this was an individual with different sexual orientation, homosexual or transsexual, while media reports heralded the discovery of the world's first gay caveman. Archaeologists and biologists, anthropologists criticised media coverage as sensationalist, as well as criticising Vanessa Volver's original statement in which she conflates sex, gender and sexuality, arguing that although burial might well represent a transgender individual, it does not necessarily mean that they had a different sexual orientation, or that their culture would have considered them homosexual. Turek notes that there are several examples of corded ware graves containing older biological males with typically female grave goods and body orientation. He suggests that aged men may have decided to retire as women for symbolic and practical reasons. The historic meaning of gender ultimately derived from the Latin genus, which meant of kind or variety. By the 20th century, this meaning was obsolete, and the word gender was almost always referred to grammatical categories, although there are a small number of examples of gender being used as a synonym for sex prior to the 20th century and even as early as 1474. This changed in the early 1970s when the work of John Money, particularly the popular college textbook Man and Women, Boy and Girl, was embraced by feminist theory. This meaning of gender is now prevalent in the social sciences, although in many other contexts gender includes sex or replaces it. As formulated by Money, gender is seen as an additional variable of sex. The later work of Robert Stoller, who innovated the term gender identity, separated gender from sex as specifically cultural and biological categories, respectively, and treated them as two different orders of data. According to the dictionaries, in the Oxford English Dictionary, gender is defined as, in a modern and especially feminist use, a euphemism for the sex of a human being, often intended to emphasize the social and cultural as opposed to the biological distinctions between the sexes, with the earliest example cited being from 1963. The American Heritage Dictionary, 5th edition, states that gender may be defined by identity as neither entirely female nor entirely male. Its usage note adds, some people maintain that the word sex should be reserved for reference to the biological aspects of being male or female, or to sexual activity, and that the word gender should be used only to refer to social cultural roles. In some situations, this distinction avoids ambiguity, as in gender research, which is clear in a way that sex research is not. The distinction can be problematic, however. Linguistically, there isn't any real difference between gender bias and sex bias, and it may seem contrived to insist that sex is incorrect in this instance. Public medical organisations working definition in use by the World Health Organization for its work is that gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for men and women, and that masculine and feminine are gender categories. The Food and Drug Administration used to use gender instead of sex when referring to physiological differences between male and female organisms. Pardon me. In 2011, they reversed their position on this and began using sex as the biological classification and gender as a person's self-representation as male or female, or how that person is responded to by social institutions based on the individual's gender presentation. Gender is also now commonly used even to refer to the physiology of non-human animals without any implication of social gender roles. Political organisations GLAAD, formerly the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, makes a distinction between sex and gender. In their media reference guide for transgender issues, they describe sex as the classification of people as male or female at birth based on bodily characteristics such as chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, and genitalia, and gender identity as a person's internal, deeply held sense of their gender. Distinction in language. Since the social science now distinguish between biologically defined sex and socially constructed gender, the term gender is now also sometimes used by linguists to refer to social gender as well as grammatical gender. Some languages such as German or Finnish have no separate words for sex and gender. German, for example, uses biologisches Desgleiches, butchered that, for biological sex, and sociologists, I can't pronounce that, for gender, making this distinction. I can't speak German, not very good at pronouncing German. Traditionally, however, a distinction has been made by linguists between sex and gender, where sex refers primarily to the attributes of real-world entities. The relative extra-linguistic attributes being, for instance, male, female, non-personal, and indeterminate sex, and grammatical genders refers to a category such as masculine, feminine, and neuter, frequently based on sex, but not exclusively so in all the languages. That determines the agreement between nouns of different genders and associated words such as articles and adjectives. A comprehensive grammar of the English language, for instance, states by gender is meant a grammatical classification of nouns, pronouns, and other words in the noun phrase according to certain meaning related distinctions, especially a distinction related to the sex of the referent. Thus, German, for instance, has 3 genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. Nouns referring to people and animals of known sex are generally referred to by nouns with the equivalent gender. Thus, man, double N, meaning man, is masculine and is associated with masculine definite article to give der Mann, while Frau, meaning woman, is feminine and is associated with a feminine definite article to give die Frau. However, the words for inanimate objects are commonly masculine, e.g. der Tischke, the table, or feminine, die Armbanduhr, the watch, and grammatical gender, butcher those, and diverge from biological sex. For instance, the female noun die Person refers to a person of either sex, and the neuter noun das Mädchen means the girl. In modern English, there is no true grammatical gender in this sense, though the differentiation, for instance, between the pronouns he and she, which in English refers to a difference in sex or social gender, is sometimes referred to as a gender distinction. A comprehensive grammar of the English language, for instance, refers to the semantically based covert gender, e.g. male and female, not masculine and feminine, of English nouns, as opposed to the overt gender of some English pronouns. This yields 9 gender classes: male, female, dual, common, collective, high male animal, higher female animal, lower animal, and inanimate, and these semantic gender classes affect the possible choices of pronouns for co-reference to the real-life entity, e.g. who and he for brother, but which and it or she for cow. Transgender people experience a mismatch between their gender identity or gender and expression and their assigned sex. Transgender people are sometimes called transsexual if they desire. Medical assistance to transition from one sex to another. Transgender is also an umbrella term in addition to including people whose gender identity is the opposite of their assigned sex. Trans men and trans women. It may include people who are non-exclusively masculine or feminine, etc. Example, people who are genderqueer, non-binary, bigender, pangender, gender fluid, or agender. Other definitions of transgender also include people who belong to a third gender or conceptualize transgender people as a third gender. Infrequently, the term transgender is defined very broadly to include cross-dressers. In summary, the definition and termination of the words sex and gender has been an ongoing debate since the 1800s. Or thereabouts, and it is still yet finalised or at least agreed upon, nor can it be credited to one person, albeit one could say Robert Stoller was the key person who separated sex and gender, whilst others discussed or proposed it. I personally don't see the reason for all the drama surrounding it. At the end of the day, the languages change and adapt over time, including the meaning of words. For example, gay used to mean happy, not someone who's homosexual. And also, if gender comes from the Latin genus, meaning variety or kind, then surely one could apply that to any sex or gender label. For example, gender non-binary would be like saying of the non-binary kind or variety, or of trans it would mean trans kind or of the trans variety. It still works no matter which direction we go with it. And if they have indeed disregarded the original Latin connection, then that doesn't work in their favour. If we say there is more than one if we say there's more than one gender, because if they kept it, they could have used it as you would the word variety, because that's what it actually means. Although it looks like they haven't physically separated the terms, etc., but have adapted the connotations and grammatical use of these words depending on the subject. But what's funny is people are getting upset about the separation of the two when they were separate to begin with. Because as we've seen, the word gender meant originally variety or kind. So it's not actually a physical thing or a physical attribute. So it is separate after all. It's between times of old and up till now where it's been used to describe physical sex, where it's nothing to do with what it means. So to get upset about it is just silly. There's loads more in this, but this will take more. It will take more than one video. So I've covered as much as I could in this video. Anyway, if you like this video and found it informative, then hit the like. And until next time, until the next video, take care, be well.